Very good to be with you and to discuss the issue of the Executive and Parliament. And I am conscious that at an event such as this, the mood in the room will be one that, frankly, the Executive is overmighty, that Parliament has been sidelined, and we must do more to strengthen the position of Parliament. And largely I'm going to agree with that, or agree with much of that. But before I make a few points to support that contention, I want to play devil's advocate as someone who was a minister for the majority of my time in Parliament and a front bencher for nearly all of it, and make the case as to why ministers and indeed their officials tend to view the Executive as being better placed to make wise decisions than Parliament, and therefore Parliament can be a bit of a nuisance. Now, I make these points in the spirit of being a devil's advocate. You will have your criticisms of these points, and I have my criticisms of those points, which I will make in due course, but bear with me for a moment or so. The first point, ministers, as compared to MPs, tend to be much better informed about their subject matter. Ministers specialise in particular areas, MPs tend to be generalists. Ministers have access to information, they have access to officials they can interrogate, but they also have access to outside stakeholders, and as a consequence, they are better informed. And indeed, I can point to some areas where that was my experience. Throughout my sort of last decade or so, I've been very heavily involved in tax policy. You would have meetings with people who understand the tax system who would complain about the state of the tax system. And by and large, I would agree with those complaints, but be of the view that trying to get anything through Parliament would be enormously difficult. It's hard in a parliamentary system. I was involved in 14 finance bills, 5 in opposition, 9 leading for the government. Finance bills scrutiny is pretty legendary within Parliament. You still hear people talking about the Rooker-Wise amendment from the 1970s and so on. I would say that the scrutiny of finance bills was not particularly something that Parliament did terribly well. And indeed, we have moved over the last decade or so to increasingly on the more technical parts of finance bills, those being looked at over a consultative period in which outside experts would provide their comments, and we develop the law that way. The experience generally of finance bills, this is no criticism of any of the front benchers I was up against, is that by and large on the technical stuff they would regurgitate what has been pointed out by the ICAEW or the Chartered Institute of Taxation. I would then have a prepared note from officials telling me how to respond to such technical concerns, and we'd all go on, and no one was necessarily much wiser or indeed better informed. So the process doesn't always work terribly well. Secondly, MPs tend to be more parochial than ministers. If it was up to MPs, we would have at least 650 general hospitals. At least. I think there are some constituencies that would want 2 or 3. I think the difficulties that we have in reforming our planning system largely is as a consequence of MPs and local pressures. We have a policy currently on steel tariffs, which is contrary to the advice that the government has received from its independent experts, which is driven by concerns of constituency MPs. We therefore have tariffs when we probably should not. Third one, and this, I'm afraid, will be contentious and come across as arrogant, but Parliament is, frankly, a mixed ability class, and by and large, we'll get to the criticisms of this in a moment, by and large, the brighter ones can progress onto the front bench. and it's probably best that some of those on the backbenchers are less influential than they would otherwise be. We'll come back to that in a moment. Fourth, that the executive very often is much better placed to make decisions. And if you want to look at the way in which Parliament struggles sometimes to make decisions, the obvious example to give is the case of Brexit, where Parliament was very clear what it did not want, but couldn't make up its mind what it wanted to do. I think there are some very specific cases. I think Brexit is a very specific case, but you could also look more widely. I would argue that the inability of Parliament to get to grips with, for example, reform of assisted dying, where, in my view, there's a very strong case for that. Public opinion supports that, but Parliament has not got to grips with that. Parliament can struggle with these issues. Fifth, Parliament can struggle to make decisions quickly. And that takes us to the whole debate over COVID, an example where I think there are widespread concerns about Parliament being sidelined, but the argument is sometimes you need to move very, very quickly. Parliament is not well placed to do that. Sixth, Parliament can be accused of playing games, and the difficulty here is that the pressure, the incentives on the opposition to vote against whatever the government is proposing is very strong, and then you might only need a relatively small number of government backbenchers who oppose the government, and you have a decision going against the government. And the best example of this, I think, is the Syria vote in 2013, where I think with hindsight, it's my view at the time, but with hindsight, a very bad decision was taken by Parliament there. And then the seventh argument is one about accountability. And this argument, and I'm very much playing devil's advocate here, is look, when most people vote, they vote on the government and the opposition, they vote about the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition, and the most democratic thing is essentially for the government to be able to pursue its policies and then be judged on those policies, and that's how our system should work. Now, let me say a few words as to why those arguments, although I think they hold some weight, are not entirely convincing. Is Parliament better informed? Well, I would argue on tax policy, Parliament has not been particularly strong, but from my own experience, other areas, justice, for example, I felt that the quality of debate, the level of knowledge and understanding of our justice system amongst parliamentarians actually happened to be very strong. I think you can point to other areas in which I had less experience, defence and foreign affairs, where there's a great deal of expertise in Parliament. We need to do more to ensure that that expertise is strengthened, that we have stronger, able, more capable people entering into Parliament. I think that point is very clear. But there is deep knowledge in a number of those areas. Is Parliament parochial? Yes, it is at times. But maybe that's a price we pay for democracy. And that is a price worth paying. Are ministers necessarily brighter than backbenchers? I suspect that over time that is the case. But I can also look at times where, frankly, I'm less convinced. We fought the last general election with the two main parties led by Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, and we had ministerial and shadow ministerial teams picked by Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. I was part of a group of cross-party backbenchers who were working together over the Brexit issues. I have to say, I remember looking around that room thinking this was possibly a more impressive group than would be found around the cabinet table or the shadow cabinet table. So one has to be careful about generalisations. Can Parliament make decisions as well as the executive? Well, I think there's a wider point here, which is important. We don't have groupthink. That challenge that Parliament can provide is really, really important. And as for Brexit as a particular issue, we had one particular problem with Brexit is that there was no status quo. There was nothing one could fall back on. If Parliament can't reach a conclusion on particular points, normally you just carry on as you are. That option wasn't available with Brexit. Can Parliament make decisions quickly? Well, sometimes it can, but I think we have to accept that COVID was a very, very exceptional case. And I think there are concerns about how long we carried on relying on emergency legislation when there should have been a more proper process. Games playing, yes, I think that is an accusation that can be made against Parliament, but again, a price for democracy, that you have to argue these points out. And as for accountability, the sort of argument, well, it's general elections, it's quite presidential, we should live with the reality. We do have to have checks and balances, and accountability isn't just about what happens at general elections. And the role of Parliament to feed in on public opinion throughout that process is hugely important. And that's where I come to, I think, the main point I would want to make. As someone who is perhaps more sympathetic to the need for governments to be able to do things than some might be, we do have to have a system of checks and balances. We do have to have the ability to challenge. We do have to have the ability to question. For the most part, laws should take their time in being created because that gives an opportunity for due consideration. And I think that is particularly important. I think we do have problems with our system at the moment, but that is driven by problems with our political parties. I think it is driven by the rise of populism and a realignment of politics that leads towards my former party being, I fear, increasingly becoming a populist party. But the solution to that, I think, probably lies more in terms of electoral reform and an ability to communicate for more liberal forces with the electorate as a whole. I would also make this point is I've been here for most of the morning, and it's been not entirely uplifting analysis of where we are in our politics for reasons that I understand and sympathise with. But if we are looking at Parliament, these things shift around. You know, people have talked about elective dictatorships for a very long time. People have talked about, you know, going back to a golden age. I will be corrected if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, not a single Conservative MP cast a single vote in the 1951-55 Parliament against a three-line whip. MPs, in many respects, have become much more independent than they once were. And as we have seen just this week, as we saw just yesterday, there is only so far that you can push MPs. I feel a sense of frustration that my former colleagues have not been more willing to cast votes against this government, not been more willing to say this is behaviour with which we will not put up with, which we will not put. But we're increasingly seeing evidence of that. And therefore, there is a degree in which certain standards are being demanded from members of Parliament. And there is evidence of MPs prepared to stand up, even in the circumstances where a government has got a very hefty majority. I don't think we should be complacent. I do think there are concerns about how our system works. And I do think that the way in which, for example, Parliament was attempted to be closed down over the prorogation in 2019 was disgraceful. But Parliament and MPs do have the ability to strike back. There is a question, as we heard from our previous speaker, about individual responsibility. And that with all the challenges that we have, I think that Parliament can continue to play a crucial role in providing the check and balance that it should do. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning everyone. So I've been asked to focus on the legislative process in terms of the balance of power between government and legislature. And two reasons for that, really. One, just before the end of last year, the House of Lords, two committees in the House of Lords published reports on the legislative process, particularly focusing on parliamentary scrutiny of delegated legislation. If you haven't read them, I'd heartily recommend them to you. And I'm not just saying that because the clerk who wrote them is in the room. But two reports: Democracy Denied, the urgent need to rebalance power between Parliament and the Executive, and the second, Government by Diktat, a call to return power to Parliament. Now, those committees were explicit in their call that they wanted to alert members of both houses and the wider public to what they describe as a potentially serious threat to a cornerstone of our constitution: effective parliamentary scrutiny of delegated legislation. Now, of course, Brexit and the pandemic has brought all of the issues with the delegated legislation system into stark relief. It was a surprise even to MPs that the Health Secretary, at the stroke of his pen, could sign into law a regulation that curbed our civil liberties during the first lockdown in spring of 2020, and he didn't have to seek parliamentary approval, retrospective approval of that, for 28 sitting days. The urgent power that he used then has since been used 100 times during the course of the pandemic, and all of it subject to retrospective scrutiny. So organisations like the Hazell Society, the Constitution Unit, the Bingham Centre, the Public Law Project, we have all been drawing attention to the fact over the last couple of years that Parliament has during this process been reduced to a retrospective rubber stamp. And the House of Lords committees, the Delegated Powers Committee and the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, made the call in their reports that the shift of power from the Parliament to the Executive over the last few years must stop. Now, at the Hazell Society, this has been a subject of our research for over a decade. So the reality is this is not new. Brexit and COVID have brought it into stark relief, but it's been something that's been a problem, not just for the last few decades, but you can go back to the 1930s for this. The Donoughmore Committee on Ministerial Powers was established because of growing disenchantment with parliamentary safeguards around the delegation of power to ministers. And rather than simply blaming ministers back then, it laid much of the responsibility for the situation at the feet of parliamentarians themselves. It said that there had been an abandonment by Parliament of its legislative functions. And I think that's a theme for us to consider in terms of the role, not just of ministers, but of members of Parliament in this process. And the whole question of institutional self-respect by both the Commons and Lords is what is the role of MPs and peers in trying to bring greater control over the delegation of power through the legislative process. I also want to stress it's an issue that is a problem for governments of all political complexions. Labour and Conservative, it's not just the Conservative governments of the last decade. Some of you in this audience will remember in the Labour government, the Legislative and Regulatory Reform Act 2006, that ring a few bells? Known by campaigners as the Abolition of Parliament Bill. So this is a problem that has been going on for a very long time. And at the Hazell Society, we launched, just before the Lords Committee reports were published, a review of delegated legislation, which we will publish our recommendations towards the end of this year. Now, in an audience like this, I'm not going to go through all the details of what the problems are with the delegated legislation system. Partly we'll be here all day, but also I'm very conscious, looking around the audience, that many of you already know and are familiar with those problems. So I just want to touch on a few of them, but then ask the question about why reform hasn't happened. If it's going on under successive governments and it's going on over decades, why are we not able to bring about change and reform if people think it is such an important constitutional problem? So the first problem is, and it's highlighted very powerfully in the Delegated Powers Committee's report last year, there are too many skeleton or framework bills. Bills that contain powers rather than policy, that reflect the push for administrative convenience. They reflect incomplete policy development. Ministers haven't fully decided what they want, so you get broad powers, and they want freedom to act at a later date. In a sense, it's a design flaw within the system where governments, in effect, are using the legislative process as a form of extended press release, really, and that the legislation is not fully ready. The Delegated Powers Committee sort of looks at each bill as it's laid before Parliament, and it's not unusual to see for bills like, for example, the Childcare Bill in 2016. It described it as virtually nothing of substance beyond the vague mission statement in Clause 1. Now, there's a related constitutional problem, I think, not just in relation to the framework bills, but what follows, because I think this process is setting up the House of Lords in the firing line, because it is the House of Lords that, by and large, is most active, certainly more active than the Commons, in trying to constrain those powers, aided by the fact that it has committees like the Delegated Powers Committee to support it, to brief it, to provide the information. And there is a real risk as we go forward that it's setting up the House of Lords for the sort of Parliament versus the people debate. The House of Lords, the unelected chamber, standing in the way of the elected will of the government on some of these pieces of legislation. The boundary between primary and delegated legislation over the years is now so blurred that that is causing significant problems. So you've got criminal offences being brought in through delegated legislation. Regulations being brought forward that have substantial financial implications, that really should have been brought in under primary legislation rather than via statutory instrument. Another problem then is that you've got precedent in the legislative process. If Parliament accepts controversial powers, as it has done, for example, throughout Brexit and COVID, it creates a precedent that makes it politically easier for it and future governments to argue in favour of taking similar powers in subsequent bills in the future. So all of this is creating a normalisation and a ratchet effect, and the problem is consequently getting worse. And then, of course, there's the famous Henry VIII powers. If a minister can, with little oversight, amend an Act of Parliament, it calls into question the whole purpose of the value of detailed scrutiny of bills. And the Lords Committees have highlighted legislative subdelegation of power and what they call disguised legislation, which, of course, we saw during the pandemic, where ministers are using guidance, protocols, determinations to legislate with the power of law, which are not subject to any forms of parliamentary scrutiny or very little. So there's then a whole set of problems with the parliamentary scrutiny. Once regulations are laid before Parliament, a whole set of problems with how those are scrutinised by MPs and by peers. The traditional issues that affect parliamentary reform, government control of the parliamentary agenda in the Commons. Very difficult for MPs to get debates in the Commons if they want one on an instrument, because the government controls the timetable. Where debates are required for affirmative instruments, the whips appoint members of the delegated legislation committees, and they're really treated as a punishment. David talked about lack of knowledge amongst some MPs, which I think you could sit in delegated legislation committees and certainly find that. But where MPs do have knowledge, that counts against them often when it comes to getting onto delegated legislation committees concerning issues about which they have some knowledge. Some of you may remember Sarah Wollaston, the former Conservative MP, who was a doctor but couldn't get on to a delegated legislation committee concerning health policy, but did get put onto DLCs about VAT, about which she admitted she knew absolutely nothing. And there's a problem relating to this whole concept of delegation of power. Parliament has no power of amendment. Now you might say, well, it shouldn't have, because this is the delegation of power. But the problem is then that means that there's no incentive, particularly for MPs, to engage significantly with this process. The take it or leave it nature of the delegated legislation process is a real disincentive to scrutiny. And of course, the lack of information that's provided by government, the lack of impact assessments, poor explanatory memoranda that's often provided. If Parliament is going to effectively scrutinise government, it has to have access to the policy and the evidence base for its decisions. But there's no constraint on the government, even when it doesn't provide that information to Parliament. There's no constraint on the government in getting those regulations through. So, given all of this, why isn't reform happening? And I think partly it's the complexity. Reforming the system would be no small undertaking. There's a whole problem about how you explain it to the media, how you explain it to the wider public, to build support for change. In Parliament, there's a real, particularly in the Commons, there's no focal point for leadership on this issue. It's not a matter for the Speaker. The Procedure Committee of the House of Commons has made recommendations previously, but its reports are ignored, passed over. It held an inquiry a few years ago, but moved on, shelved it and moved on to other issues. A big problem is there's insufficient political interest from the opposition. There's a conspiracy of silence almost between the front benches. The opposition chief whip no more wants reform than the government chief whip, because they're going to inherit this system, they hope, in a few years' time, and they want the freedom that this system would give them. I think there's also a problem amongst MPs of political appetite. Until a problem arises with a statutory instrument affecting their constituents, whether it's tax credits or universal credit, or as we saw during the pandemic, getting MPs to engage with the detail of this is incredibly difficult. Where's the political mileage in spending your time on an instrument that you can't change? How do you change that dynamic? And there's a real knowledge problem. Few MPs, and it's particularly a problem since the last general election, but few MPs actually have knowledge and understand the system, so complex has it become. And if you think only a quarter of the House of Commons have been in the House since before 2010, so their experience of the legislative process prior to that time is very different. So the question is, why should this particular moment perhaps be any different? Why would we do our review now and have any hope or expectation that things might change? We're having to give an awful lot of thought to the political incentive structure in terms of reform that's needed to persuade both a government and an opposition to try and commit to some changes. Firstly, I think there's going to be a lot of statutory instruments in contentious policy areas. Brexit and the pandemic, of course, heightened interest and awareness. I don't think that's going to drop off now. If you think about trade agreements are going to be implemented by statutory instruments, complex provisions of the Northern Ireland Protocol, whether it's agriculture, environment, subsidies, immigration, they're all going to be coming through with statutory instruments. We await, of course, the Brexit Freedoms Bill, which I gather will be the retained EU law bill, in the next Queen's speech. There's going to be a lot of statutory instruments that will flow from that. I think the volume of statutory instruments has also been a challenge for the government departments to address, and I think that's an area where we can look to try and persuade the government to change. Procedural reforms that could smooth out some of the administrative problems will be helpful in terms of persuading certainly the civil service end that there's a case for change. And I think there's another political factor. Powers in bills today are available to ministers in the future, and I think it's interesting that amongst ministers at the moment when they're bringing bills through, there's not a lot of thought given to the implications of what those powers are going to be able to do in the future if they're in the hands of another minister. There's a sort of lack of stewardship in the approach. There's got to be at least a risk of minority government after the next election, and you can do an awful lot in a minority government with statutory instruments if you cannot get primary legislation through the House of Commons. If you cannot, we want to avoid votes, you want to avoid amendments. So I think there's a possibility of engaging interest on that side of things. What are we looking at very briefly at society in terms of our review, just as something for you to think about? Establishing a clearer boundary between primary and delegated legislation, looking at the menu of scrutiny options, throwing out negative and affirmatives and looking at a broader range of options, a sifting process that enables you to sort the wheat from the chaff so that parliamentarians can focus their scrutiny on what matters, looking at the resources available to MPs through this process. I mean, you compare it to the resourcing of policy via select committees or to financial matters via the NAO or the scrutiny unit in the House of Commons, and the resourcing of the legislative process is actually quite poor. New Statutory Instruments Act, it's 76 years old, so it's ripe for review. And there are some difficult questions, though, we've got to answer. Should Parliament be able to amend statutory instruments? What are the respective roles of the Commons and the Lords in this? What should be the resources and support. What are the implications of that in these tight economic times? So that is the array of questions that we're looking at, and we'll be publishing our recommendations towards the end of the year, drafting a new Statutory Instruments Act, and also standing orders as a package that we hope then that we can put forward and engage people to, I won't say campaign on, but certainly advocate for. Thank you.
My thanks to Nat and to Andrew and the Constitution Society for inviting me to talk today. I've been invited because of a book I've just finished writing about the prerogative, and it's going to be published later this year by Hart. The title is Executive Power, the Prerogative, Past, Present and Future. And it's written with a co-author, a brilliant young chancery lawyer called Tim Foote, and we were ably assisted by an equally brilliant research volunteer, Charlotte Sayers-Carter. My thanks to both of them. They're not here today, but without them I could not possibly have written this book. It's quite a big book. It's 19 chapters long. It has separate chapters about all the different prerogative powers, both great and small, ranging from the power of dissolution to lesser-known prerogatives like the prerogative of mercy. You will be relieved, not going to try and talk about the whole book today. I'm going to talk just about one of the concluding chapters in the book, which is titled The Prerogative and Parliament. And I'm going to give a talk in 3 parts. First, I'm going to try and summarize very briefly the developments of the last 20 years. Second part, I'm going to focus just on 3 prerogative powers, the war-making power, ratification of treaties, and a lesser-known power, the power to issue passports, and Parliament's attempts to regulate each of those powers more tightly. And then in conclusion, I'm going to reflect on some of the reasons why it's proved difficult for Parliament to get a stronger or more effective handle on some of these prerogative powers, those reasons being partly institutional, but partly specific and intrinsic to the powers concerned. So, part 1, the developments of the last 20 years. Well, up until the present millennium, for at least 300 years, from 1688 onwards, the executive was really dominant in its use of the prerogative, the power to summon, dissolve and prorogue Parliament, powers over foreign affairs, including the power to make war and to enter into treaties, the grant of honours, the issue of passports. All these things remained in the hands of the executive. Parliament, in theory, could abolish, abridge or alter any of these prerogatives, but it chose not to do so. That began to change in the new millennium, and initially thanks to a campaign by a single parliamentary select committee, the Public Administration Select Committee, very ably chaired by Tony Wright. And to set out their stall, in 2004 they published a seminal report called Taming the Prerogative, and under Tony's chairmanship they then set out individual reports on each of the different prerogative powers, a steady stream of reports which are listed in a long table in our book. There were 7 reports under Tony's chairmanship, but the campaign then continued under his successors, Bernard Jenkin and now William Wragg, and under their chairmanship there have been 8 more reports on war powers, treaties, honours, passports, regulation of the civil service, public appointments, and appointments to the House of Lords. So not much happened so long as Blair remained Prime Minister, but as soon as Gordon Brown became PM, he picked up the agenda which had been sketched out by Tony Wright and his committee, and Brown, you may remember, in his first week in office, announced very ambitious plans to reform every aspect of the prerogative: war powers, treaties, passports, public and judicial appointments, regulation of the civil service. But sadly, that all gradually became attenuated, partly because of the economic crisis in 2008, partly because Number 10 under Brown became a black hole, where lots of submissions went in but few decisions came back out, until all that survived in the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, passed right at the end of the Brown government's term in 2010, was two things: putting the Civil Service Commission on a statutory basis and codification of the Ponsonby Rule on ratification of treaties. Stage 2 in my chronology, phase 2, was, perhaps surprisingly, further regulation of the prerogative under the coalition. And here I'm just going to talk about two things. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which you will know all about. In part, it had a political purpose to shore up the coalition, but in part it had a purpose explicitly stated by Nick Clegg when introducing the legislation to limit the power of the executive and to remove the right of the Prime Minister to choose the date of the next election. And then, perhaps surprisingly, under the coalition, there was in effect further regulation of the war-making power. Gordon Brown had proposed a parliamentary resolution setting up the process that Parliament should follow before approving any deployment of the armed forces, but he was in effect never tested in office. But when Cameron became Prime Minister, within the space of only 4 years, there were 4 separate debates and votes in Parliament about military action, most famously the one that David referred to earlier, the vote in August 2013, when Parliament in fact voted against proposed bombing of Syria. And those successive precedents enabled commentators at the time to say there is now an established convention that the government would not deploy the armed forces overseas without recourse to Parliament. That confident assertion has since proved misplaced, because in phase 3 of my brief chronology, my title is The Pendulum Swings Back, Reassertion of Executive Dominance. Because Theresa May, and after her Boris Johnson, have reasserted executive control in 3 respects. And the first is in relation to the war-making power, because in April 2018, Theresa May authorized military action in Syria without seeking prior parliamentary approval. Second, on the ratification of treaties, that became a very live issue throughout the whole Brexit saga, and initially, thanks partly to David and some of his colleagues in Parliament, Parliament tightened up the requirements in Crag with a so-called meaningful vote. But that requirement was subsequently repealed by the European Union Withdrawal Act, passed with minimal parliamentary scrutiny, and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement Bill was passed in just 1 day, so very little time to scrutinise either the treaty or the implementing legislation. Finally, the power of dissolution. You will know that the Fixed Term Parliaments Act has now been repealed, and the government was quite explicit about its objectives in getting rid of that legislation. The explanatory memorandum to the bill, when introduced, said, once more, Parliament will be dissolved by the Sovereign on the advice of the Prime Minister. This will enable governments to call a general election at the time of their choosing. Let me move on now to part 2 and briefly talk about 3 particular prerogative powers. First, the war-making power. Since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, 4 parliamentary committees have conducted 6 different inquiries to consider how to ensure that government could not embark on military action without the prior approval of the House of Commons. And they've proposed and explored 3 possible mechanisms. 1, an informal convention based on precedent. Second, a more formal convention, which would be embodied in a resolution of the House of Commons. And third, legislation, setting out the conditions government would need to satisfy before it could wage war. Legislation has been ruled out and acknowledged in the most recent report by PASC's successor committee, PACAC, because it raised too many difficult questions. How to define the sort of military action that would trigger parliamentary involvement, when could the government circumvent on grounds of urgency, the risk of judicial review, etc. But Under Cameron's premiership, successive instances of the government seeking parliamentary approval, as I've said, suggested there was a recognised convention that the government wouldn't deploy armed forces without prior recourse to Parliament. That was then undermined in 2018, when Theresa May authorised the military action in Syria without seeking prior approval, and she at the time offered 4 reasons why she had decided not to consult Parliament: to protect the effectiveness of military operations, to guard shared intelligence, to preserve collaboration with our allies, and to provide humanitarian relief. Are those now 4 exceptions to the Convention? It illustrates the weakness of relying on informal conventions. What is now the status of the Convention? Is it, given the breadth of those exemptions, especially the first, the need to protect the effectiveness of military operations, is the Convention now in effect optional? Second, the ratification of treaties. You might think that parliamentary control is stronger now that it is enshrined in statute. The rule under Cragg is that the government cannot ratify a treaty unless it's first laid before Parliament for 21 sitting days, and if the House of Commons passes a resolution against ratification, another 21 sitting day delay is triggered, and it could, in theory, go on ad infinitum. But Cragg in practice, and this new statutory rule about the ratification of treaties, has remained almost a dead letter, because neither House has yet passed a resolution against ratification. But as a result of Brexit, interest in treaties has greatly increased in Parliament, and there have been intense discussions over whether Parliament should adopt a more systematic approach, with the Lords showing a much greater interest than the Commons. So just 2 years ago, in March 2020, the Lords established an International Agreement Subcommittee, which was upgraded last year to a full select committee. It's chaired by Diane Hayter, and its remit is to consider the negotiation and implementation of all treaties and international agreements presented to Parliament. It's still feeling its way. It's still experiencing lots of weaknesses in terms of its scrutiny power. Let me just give you one example from the last few days. The government's Rwanda plan falls into a scrutiny gap because it's not a treaty with binding effect in international law. It's just a memorandum of understanding, and so it's not therefore subject to Cragg. So there are many ways in which Cragg needs to be strengthened, but I don't have time to go into them now. Finally, on passports. The Brown government gave a pledge to remove the prerogative in relation to passports, but it ran out of time before it could introduce legislation to that effect. And since then, so far as I know, parliamentary interest has completely faded. So as a result, the issue, the withdrawal or the refusal of a passport remains at the discretion of the Home Secretary. And bizarrely, the rules are not set out in any secondary legislation, but they're simply contained in occasional statements delivered to Parliament by the Home Secretary. From memory, the last one was about 5 years ago. Legislation should be perfectly possible. Australia and New Zealand, which inherited the same tradition of passports being a prerogative power, have both passed a Passports Act in the last 20 to 30 years. If Tony Wright was still in Parliament, I wonder whether he would still be campaigning vigorously for that. Finally, some brief conclusions. I offer you 3 possible reasons why parliamentary control of the prerogative has not been more sustained or effective. The first is lack of political will. Politicians like Tony Wright, sadly, are rare exceptions. Second, I think there's a lack of institutional capacity and expertise. That's illustrated perhaps by Parliament's attempts to regulate the war-making power and a growing recognition in Parliament about the difficulties involved, the changing nature of modern warfare, with drone strikes, cyber war, and the like, and also a growing recognition of the difficulty of the government sharing sometimes sensitive intelligence, which would enable Parliament to have a properly informed debate. Finally, and perhaps most obviously, executive resistance. It varies, I think, depending on the importance of the power in question. So, in our book, I suggested it's perhaps no coincidence that it's been the war-making power and the power of dissolution, both really important powers, that have seen the greatest executive pushback. But it doesn't explain continuing resistance to codification of lesser prerogative powers like passports. It remains to me a puzzle why Parliament hasn't insisted on codification of the Home Secretary's policy. To show how it could be done, I wish that the Home Affairs Committee might take the initiative and produce a draft passports bill, as PASC produced a draft civil service bill under Tony Wright's chairmanship to show the government the way forward. And that brings me back to the lack of political will and what you might call a lack of institutional confidence, because I think most MPs wouldn't regard it as their job to try and draft a passports bill. That's seen as a matter for government, which has the expertise and the responsibility.